Welcome to mindfulness as a pedagogical tool for transforming biased habits of mind around race. I'm Dr. Renee Owen. I'm assistant professor at Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon. This class brings together transformative learning theory and mindfulness techniques as a powerful combination for helping people in workforce learning who are taking classes that are often called diversity classes to be able to move beyond white fragility. I do identify as a white female, and I present this class from the perspective of a white person. I typically teach diversity or implicit bias classes with a person of color, but this class is going to focus on the white folks that are in the room in these trainings. Participants will learn how to facilitate mindfulness practices that support transforming unconscious racial biases into more inclusive mindsets and behaviors. So let's get started. In the last decade, events portrayed in the news and social media have certainly brought greater attention to racial inequalities, racial inequities, and the need for better education around racial identity and inclusion. Diversity classes, or implicit bias classes, as they are often called, have become a common requirement in workplaces and in higher education. However, white fragility has been a strong barrier to successful racial equity education. The reason it's been such a barrier, white fragility, and that's a term that was really picked up by Robin DiAngelo in her book about white fragility, is because of the very implicit nature of racial bias. Implicit means it's unconscious. People are not aware of it. So that makes white people unable to see their socialized racism. So I take a lens of transformative learning when I'm teaching these classes. When I recognize the resistance and disorienting emotions that many white people experience in these classes as a transformative learning experience, then I can build practices into my teaching that helps open up hearts and minds to become more inclusive. I approach racism not as an individual act of intentional aggression or malice, typically, but as a societal condition that almost everyone enacts on a daily basis, usually without awareness. So I recognize that when I'm teaching these classes I have a goal of changing people's unconscious, socially conditioned perspectives and habits of mind, and that's an incredibly complex task. So when I only have 3 to 5 hours to completely change people's perspectives on race and how they see themselves, and typically they see themselves as good people who are not racist, then I'm putting them through an incredibly uncomfortable class where they are learning that they have been perpetuating white supremacy their whole life without necessarily understanding that or knowing that. Again, I recognize this as a transformative learning process. Transformative learning theory is usually credited to Jack Mesereau. The definition I'm going to use for transformative learning is the process of noticing, critically reflecting upon, and changing socially conditioned mental models that are typically outside of our awareness. Exactly what I'm trying to do in these classes. Briefly, I'm displaying here the 10 steps in Jack Mesereau's theory of transformative learning. But we are going to focus on these 5 steps displayed here. In particular, I want to start with understanding how important the disorienting dilemma is as the first step of transformative learning theory. And in terms of the disorienting dilemma, that's exactly what's happening in these classes. Taking a student through the experience of seeing a blind spot that they did not know that they had, like recognizing that they have been racist their whole lives, that's certainly a disorienting dilemma. What's important then is to take them through that disorienting dilemma so that they can learn from it rather than resisting it. And that's the point of these mindfulness practices. But we can only do that by setting up a holding environment. A holding environment requires laying a level of safety in the class so that students can open up and share without being defensive. Here's a practice for how we do that. This is a simple activity. It's so simple that it's just a part of the introductions of the class. We ask people to simply say their names, their role in the company, and we also ask them to say where they are from, such as where they grew up. Simple enough. And then we put them in small groups. And we ask them in those small groups, like groups of 4 or 5, to share something. Now, once they're in small groups, remember, we're trying to set up a holding environment, things become much safer. People can take risks and they can share. So typically once they're in small groups, they're laughing and they're all starting to share now and being more open. And what we ask them to share is to think about where they're from and imagine they're maybe like at a cocktail party or some event. And when people ask you where you're from, what impression do you think they have of you just based on that information of where you're from? And so when we come back and share as a whole group, some of the examples are really interesting. Now, we were teaching these classes in the South, and people would talk about how if they were from Florida, they would notice that people would automatically think that they are a poor driver, for instance. But that would be a funny example. Or they would talk about if they met someone from the Northeast, they might assume that they're pushy or brash. And then some would be more serious. They would talk about how if they were from Alabama, even if they were from an urban area, people tend to assume, in their experience, that they are undereducated or ignorant. And so this opens the class up to recognizing that everyone has bias, but yet we have not talked about race yet. So after introducing people to accept the fact that humans are just naturally biased, I provide the brain science and recent neurological research around why our brains are biased. I'm not going to provide that now in this presentation, but I have provided a lot of references for you. I'll just say quickly that I mostly circulate around 3 types of reasons for the neuroscience behind bias. One being the triune brain and our primal brain, how our primal brain is constantly scanning for danger outside of our awareness. And as soon as it finds something that's unfamiliar, that's a signal of danger. The second one is the fact that our brains have to constantly categorize, and we do that for very good reasons to be efficient, yet, of course, that causes issues with bias. And the third main reason that I talk about is the fact that we are social, tribal animals, and that's great having a tribe. The problem is the outgroups. So again, our brain is signaling danger when we see someone who does not seem like they are within our tribe. So it's important for participants to understand that even though our brain behaves in this way, we can train our brain and our mind to behave differently with mindfulness. So just as we would go to the gym to work on our physical body in order to change it, the way it looks and the way it acts, we use mindfulness as a tool and as an exercise to change our brains. Because even though the neuroscience shows that we are naturally biased, the neuroscience also shows that our brains are plastic and we can change the way we think. We can use mindfulness to be able to see what's going on in our unconscious and change that. So this is where I introduce the definition of mindfulness. There are several definitions. The one I use is basically John Kabat-Zinn's definition: being in the present moment, non-judgmentally, on purpose. And now we'll launch into explaining some of the exercises, the mindfulness exercises that I do with students. The first mindfulness activity is extremely simple. As I describe this to you, I recommend, as this is an experiential workshop, that you do it along with me. I set it up so that the students feel as safe as possible, especially those who are not accustomed to doing mindfulness exercises. Typical of mindfulness, I'll ask them to find a position in their seat that is comfortable. Sometimes I'll say upright, but not uptight. Safety, as I said, is very important. There's a lot of research around how mindfulness can sometimes trigger trauma in people who've been traumatized because it brings up these things that are happening in the brain. And so I keep it very simple. I'll invite them to close the eyes, but not require that they close their eyes. I'll say, I invite you to close your eyes, or to just soften your gaze and look at perhaps a blank spot on the table. And then I'll say, all we're going to do is simply breathe and watch your breath. Be present with your breath and not judge it in any way. You don't need to change it. You don't need to do anything with it. Just simply watch the breath. I'll let them know I'm going to remain quiet for a moment. I'll step in at a certain point and say, by now your mind might have wandered and you have taken your attention off your breath. That's perfectly okay. This is your chance to bring it back to simply watching the breath without judgment in any way. We'll do that for merely 60 seconds, maybe 90 seconds. And during that short mindfulness meditation, I might explain during the meditation, or I might explain when we come out, that our breath is not something that we usually pay much attention to. It's both something that can be voluntary or involuntary. Typically it's involuntary. It's just going on the background all the time, just like that part of our brain that's always scanning for danger, or all those unconscious things. Our breath is usually unconscious. And by focusing on it, we learn to pay attention to what's going on to the unconscious. The second exercise that I do with them is just about as simple. Remember, I'm going along and teaching the course with my teaching partner, and we're providing also a lot of content. Some of it is pretty disturbing. And so it's helpful at this point to also use the mindfulness simply to give them a break and to help them digest the material. But watching thoughts is the next step from watching breath. So I set it up exactly the same way as watching the breath. But after they watch the breath for a couple breaths, then I'll explain. And now all you're going to do is watch your thoughts. Just be present to your thoughts without any judgment, not trying to change them whatsoever. And by thoughts, we mean all mental activities, as Dan Siegel describes thoughts. So that means also feelings and emotions, longings, dreams, memories, all mental activities. Just watch. I'll give them some moments of silence. I'll remind them that they may have taken their mind off of their thoughts at this point, and ask them again to just pay attention to their thoughts. I will explain that by watching our thoughts, we become conscious of them, and we start to realize that our thoughts do not have to control us, that we can pay attention to them and we can be more aware of them, and we can exercise that muscle of mindfulness. There's another point in the training where I ask people, okay, who all has a fast-paced job? And usually there's muffled giggles or murmurs because everybody has a fast-paced job, and they'll raise their hand. And a lot of these people are often servers, or they're working in a brewery or someplace that's moving exceptionally fast. And so I'll explain to them that, of course, they cannot literally slow down their bodies while they're doing their job, but by exercising this mindfulness and watching their thoughts, they can become more mindful. So if they're working the door, for instance, they start to notice what their implicit biases are of the people that come to them. Now, as the course goes on, students are ingesting a lot of content and other experiences that we're providing in the class that is pretty intense. They're learning brutal facts about systemic racism, the history of racism, and they can be experiencing some extreme emotions ranging from deep shame and guilt to rage. So this is a good time to introduce self-compassion as a mindfulness exercise. It can help them acknowledge and accept these emotions and process them, and move through the transformative learning process so that these emotions don't get in the way of their learning. In fact, so the emotions help them learn. The self-compassion process that we use is very similar to one that's been introduced by Kristen Neff. I'll drop them into the state similar to I did with the earlier exercises in the course, the breathing and watching the thoughts. Feel free to do this along with me. So I'll ask them to notice the emotions that they're having, the thoughts that they're having, and recognize that they might be intense. And I'll tell them that step one of this self-compassion exercise is to simply acknowledge that they're feeling that way. And that's it. That it really is true that they are feeling this way and that it's okay. In fact, step two, I'll ask them to consider putting their hand over their heart and recognizing that all humans have had similar feelings and emotions. This is part of the transformative learning process, is that recognizing others have been in the same position, empathizing with oneself and with one another, and recognizing our humanity. I always give a moment in between these. And then the third step is I'll tell them to offer themselves something that they need. It might be forgiveness. It might be strength. It might be patience. And those are the 3 steps of the self-compassion mindfulness exercise. When we come back to the room, I'll sometimes ask them to notice what's different from before we did the exercise. And often the responses are things like calm, or they feel like they can move forward. The final mindfulness activity, one of the final steps in the transformative learning journey, taking on the new role of being anti-racist, taking on the new role of being inclusive in their workplace. And it's a meta-kindness mindfulness activity. So it's just slightly changed from most meta-kindness activities that you may be familiar with, if you are familiar with them, where typically 4 phrases are said out loud, repeated, or silently. So after taking people into a meditative state, the phrases are, may I be happy, may I be safe, may I be healthy, and may I experience well-being. And after saying may I, you'll focus on someone that you love and wish them, may you be happy, may you be safe, may you be healthy, may you experience well-being. Then I'll ask them to focus on someone who's very different than them, perhaps someone of a different race. Could be someone they know, could be someone they don't know. And to imagine them and to say those phrases, thinking of this other person. May you be happy. May you be safe. May you be healthy. And may you be well. And then sometimes I'll do the final step, which is imagining all of humanity and all of living beings and saying that about all of us. May we be happy. May we be safe. May we be healthy. May we experience the well-being. The metta meditation is somewhat of a mindfulness finale for the class. Jack Mesereau said, "What we have in common are human connectedness, the desire to understand, and spiritual incompleteness. Human suffering is greatly alleviated when we understand that our suffering and our joy is connected to the suffering and joy of all other humans and living beings." So it's wonderful to bring the class to a close on that note. Mesereau saw transformative learning as a path of liberation. To quote him, the continuous creation of new categories, openness to new information, and an implicit awareness of more than one perspective. I hope you have found this class useful and liberating. Thank you.